of Acts, where we've been following the trial of the Apostle Paul. And it's moved through different stages. Paul has been moved now to a place called Caesarea, which is just on the Mediterranean coast. And as he's in Caesarea, he's facing the next section. And we're going to spend 2 weeks here in chapter 25 and chapter 26. This week we'll look at what Paul says in his trial. We'll look at the defense that he makes. And as we do that, we'll understand some vital things about the message of Christianity. And then next week, I want us to look at the response that we see to what Paul says. In other words, what those listening do. Because as we do that, we see some vital things about how to respond to the message of Christianity. So this week, the message. Next week, the response. But let me just remind you or orientate you to where we've got to. What we really have is an escalating trial. From his arrival in Jerusalem, the Apostle Paul faces opposition, and it leads to a local trial before the city authorities. And that doesn't resolve his case, so things move to a regional level, they kind of escalate up one. And that was chapter 24, you can go back and read that. Paul was brought before the regional Roman governor, who at that time was a man called Felix. And he oversaw the whole region of Judea, and Felix held him for 2 years. But still, his case wasn't resolved. Then what happens is Felix is replaced, he's moved away, and a new governor, Festus, arrives. And he's wanting to start off well with the locals. This is where our chapter begins. And there's some political manoeuvring going on. And we're told in chapter 25, verse 9, he wants to do the Jewish population a favour. And so he basically fast-tracks the trial of the Apostle Paul. And that's where we hear Paul's first defence. And this one is more about legal procedure. And it ends significantly, we'll come back to this next week, in chapter 25, verse 10, with Paul appealing to Caesar. But Paul said, I'm standing before Caesar's tribunal where I ought to be tried. To the Jews I've done no wrong, as you yourself know very well. If then I'm a wrongdoer and have committed anything for which I deserve to die, I don't seek to escape death. But if there's nothing to their charges against me, no one can give me up to them. I appeal to Caesar. And so Festus takes some legal advice quickly with his counsel. And he concludes that Paul is right as a Roman citizen in his appeal. And so Paul will be sent on to Rome. His case will go to the emperor himself, which is about the highest escalation that you can get. Now, during all this time, the regional king and his wife come to visit, Agrippa and Bernice. During their stay, Festus is talking to them about everything that's going on. And he brings up the case of Paul. And he says, listen, I don't find him guilty, but I'm in this strange position where he's appealed to go to Caesar. I'm going to send him to Caesar. I'm going to need to write a letter. I don't really know what to say, because his case is just so confusing. And so the king says, I really want to hear it, I'm fascinated. Paul then is brought before the king, where he makes a second, longer defence. And in those two speeches, to the governor and then to the king, we see so much of the nature of the Christian message. And very simple this afternoon, I'm going to draw out 2 pairs. 2 pairs that Paul holds together when it comes to the message of Christianity. And they are these. The message of Christianity, the first pair, is historical and personal. Second is respectful and challenging. 2 pairs that sound like they shouldn't fit, but you find them both. So let's deal with this first one. This is the longest. It's historical and personal. See, as you look at Paul's message, what you find out is that it is unmistakably rooted in history. It's a message about things that have happened. It's about events that have taken place. It is, in that sense, about facts. But then at the same time, it's profoundly personal. Paul speaks about it as a message that connects at the very deepest of human levels. It's not simply about facts, it enters the arena of feelings. It is objective and it's subjective. So I'm going to start with the historical side, because as Paul makes his defence, he describes many things that have taken place, things that were known and provable. Look at his language. Let's look. It starts with the fact that he makes a defence. You get that phrase is used 4 times through these chapters. And that's a courtroom phrase. It's a word that's often used in relation to evidence. Paul is making a formal defence. He is answering charges against him, and the way he's doing it is by making a really clear and really accurate case. Which is why when he sums up what he said, after he's accused basically of being completely out of his mind, in chapter 26 and verse 25, here's how he defends himself. He says, I'm not out of my mind, most excellent Festus, but I am speaking true and rational words. For the king knows about these things, and to him I speak boldly. For I am persuaded that none of these things has escaped his notice, for this has not been done in a corner. It's a fascinating description of what he said the Christian message is about. The word rational there has a sense of being sound, the opposite of what he's been accused of, which is being crazy. He says, no, I'm speaking the truth. And he also says, none of this is hidden. This was all on public display. Everything about the life of Jesus, everything that's followed, with all that you've seen in the church ever since, his phrase is, it wasn't done in a corner. This is not smoke and mirrors. Everybody, this was in the public eye. He says, that's what I'm speaking about. That's how Paul shares the message of Christianity. Now, that's very important, because Luke has a large purpose. He's the author in writing Acts. In fact, Acts really isn't just a book on its own. If you've been around in the series, you'll know this by now. But it's the continuation of his narrative of the life of Jesus. So Luke has one of the Gospels in the New Testament, one of the accounts of Jesus' life. And Acts and Luke just follow on. They're one narrative. And when he starts that Gospel in Luke chapter 1, verses 1 to 4, he's very clear about what he's doing in his writing, and then in Luke, and then further on in Acts. He says this, inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered unto us, it seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus. That's basically the sponsor who he's writing for, that you may have certainty concerning the things that you have been taught. That's the description. He says, that's why I'm writing. I'm collecting eyewitness accounts, I'm documenting the history, all of it, he says, so readers might be certain of everything that's taken place. That is another way of Luke saying all of this is based in historical reality. And it's exactly the same for what he writes in Acts as well. And it's exactly the same as what you'll find in Paul's words as he continues to share the message of Christianity. Here's what I'm saying. This is a hallmark of all Christianity. It is a factual message. It is a historical message. Now, there are so many things that means. There are so many places we could take it. But let me just take it to one place. Here's what it means. It means that faith is not blind. The Christian faith does not require you switching off to reality. What do I mean? Well, Paul keeps coming back to the resurrection. I don't know if you've noticed that. And if you've followed the series through, Paul continually comes back to the resurrection. He mentions it as central in all his preaching and teaching. The resurrection of Jesus, he says, is the reason he's on trial. And it's a central part of the message he shares. Festus, his feet have hardly touched the ground, he says, I've already learned that it's the key issue that the religious rulers have when it comes to Paul. He says in chapter 25 and verse 19, they have certain points of dispute with him about their own religion and about a certain Jesus who was dead, but whom Paul asserted to be alive. So the resurrection is key. But here is something we miss, and I think it's significant. We often look back, and I think, here is what we think. People in the past were really gullible. Or if not gullible, then certainly they were just way more desperate to believe than we were. They were kind of looking for stuff to believe in. And it's very easy for us to think, well, look, we've moved on, we're far more sophisticated and advanced. These people, back then, they wanted to believe in miracles. They were just desperate for a miracle to happen, and then they would just pick anything and they would call it a miracle. But here is a really odd thing when you read the accounts of the Bible around Easter. Jesus told his disciples repeatedly he would die, and on the third day he would rise again. He kept saying it. But on the third day, nobody expects it. None of his followers. The only followers who do anything are the women who come with spices and perfumes ready to anoint a corpse. The rest of the disciples don't even check. They don't think Jesus is risen back to life again. Now, why didn't they believe this? Well, let me quote a New Testament scholar, a guy called Tom Wright. He says this: Christianity was born into a world where its central claim was known to be false. Many believed that the dead were non-existent. Outside Judaism, nobody believed resurrection. Do you hear that? So back here, the concept of resurrection was ridiculous. Nobody in the pagan world of Jesus' day believed it. Death was a one-way street. Nobody came back down it. Pagans didn't believe in the resurrection, and only a handful of Jewish people believed in the kind of general possibility of a future resurrection, but nothing like what was claimed for Jesus. So what is the point? Here's the simple point. You did not have crowds of people waiting for the resurrection of Jesus. And as Paul declares the resurrection, he doesn't have a crowd desperate to believe it. Quite the opposite, in fact. Paul was dealing with an even more hostile and skeptical group of people when it came to the resurrection than any audience today. So here's the vital question. In a world where no one believed in resurrection, how come these early Christians did? How come the church is formed around a belief that Jesus is alive? What caused them to believe? Here I think is the reason. They let the evidence change them. They were confronted with exactly the historical reality that Paul presents in his defense. They saw these things, they allowed themselves to be encountered by the truth, they were persuaded by the facts. Do you see that? The Christian message is historical. It invites you to examine it, to come see, to come examine, to come see what you think about the events that happened. Let me encourage you to do that if you've never done it. But it goes one step further. Because Christianity is this unique combination of the historical and the personal. It is the historical entering the personal. Look at Paul's message. He repeats again the road to Damascus conversion. So we get it in detail again in chapter 26 and verse 12. If you've been here through the whole series, you're thinking, really? We're going to go here again. This is like sermon number 4 on the Damascus Road conversion. I mean, I could do that. I love the Damascus Road conversion. But if this is the third account of it in the book of Acts, you have to say, why? Because Luke is such a careful writer. He knows space is limited. So why is it repeated so many times? So many other details are missed out through the book of Acts. Actually, things that you read past and think, I would love to know some more about that. And yet you get a full account of the Damascus Road conversion 3 times. Here is why. It's because it was foundational for Paul's reality. It was utterly foundational. It was the moment where Jesus became personal. The moment where Jesus steps into Paul's reality. Let me put it this way. Where the historical explodes into the personal. Jesus stops simply being out there for Paul and he ignites in here. And it still feels as though Paul can't get over what's happened. It still feels as if he can't believe this is true for him. How he went from raging, furious persecution to giving everything for the sake of Jesus. But Jesus did encounter him personally. The truth has touched his heart. And actually, I think this brings something that all of us are looking for. It's this deeply satisfying outcome of profound feelings based on reliable facts. Isn't that what we want? Isn't that really what it's something real? Something we can be confident in, that isn't fake, that isn't airbrushed, that isn't all of the, something that we know is real, but that actually sets the heart alight. That's what we want. But how do you get that? Well, the circumstances will be different from Paul, but the experience can be the same. That is why he's sharing the message. He's sharing the message so all who hear can experience this. The gospel is that Jesus can become personal to us. You know why? Because he made it personal for him. He made it personal for him. His Damascus Road words, chapter 26, verse 14 and 15, Jesus says, "This is my church." More, extraordinary words, "you are persecuting me." Me, he says. Not just this group of individuals down here, me. On the cross, Jesus utterly identifies with us. On the cross, Jesus buys a people for himself. The church become his treasured possession. And so through his life, his death, and his resurrection, he so identifies with us that he joins us to himself. He calls us his body. In faith, we're united to him. That's how true it can be for you. That's how the historical Jesus, through faith, can become a personal reality. Do you know that? Do you know that? Have you experienced that? Not just the Jesus who is out there, hovering somewhere vaguely in the plane of history, but the one who has descended and exploded into a personal reality. He can be known like that. Historical and personal. Here's briefly where we'll finish. Respectful and challenging. That's the next thing you see about this message. At every stage in this trial, Paul treats his accusers with a deep and real respect. Now, can I remind you the hostility Paul faces? Back in chapter 24 and verse 5, his accusers describe him as a plague. And he's literally viewed by them as a disease. Which makes me quote Home Alone every time. I hear that. Like Kevin is such a... every time I hear that, it's the same. That's how they view Paul. Pestilence. Plague. And he's nearly been killed by the crowd numerous times. He's already escaped one planned murder attempt. Chapter 25 verse 3 says they're still trying to kill him with an ambush. Second attempt at the plan that failed the first time. He's then been imprisoned for 2 years because Felix, the former governor, was hoping to make some money from him. Hoped his supporters would come and kind of pay some bribes and a deal could be done. 2 years, that's a long time. He even now is still in chains. And the reason I say all of that is because this isn't a calm, neutral situation that Paul speaks from. This was aggressive. This was hostile. And yet still, he speaks with honour and respect. He's reasoned. He's calm. He's not lashed out. He's not pleaded special treatment. He simply insisted on due process, on being treated in the way that every Roman citizen should. Look at the way he addresses the king, chapter 26. "I consider myself fortunate that it's before you, King Agrippa, I'm going to make my defense today against all the accusations of the Jews, especially because you are familiar with all the customs and controversies of the Jews. Therefore I beg you to listen to me patiently." Honour, respect. Same with Festus. Festus turns around to him in chapter 26, verse 25, he says, you are out of your mind. And he turns around and says, "Most excellent Festus." A term of honour, a term of respect. He's also deeply respectful of his Jewish background. At no point does he lash out. Chapter 26, And verse 4, he listens to the way he speaks. My manner of life from youth, spent from the beginning among my own nation in Jerusalem, is known by all of the Jews. They've known for a long time, if they're willing to testify, that according to the strictest part of religion, our religion, I lived as a Pharisee. You keep finding this the whole way through his trial. He treats his accusers with respect and dignity. Think about that. Because it should sound familiar. Because what we're seeing in Paul is a reflection of what we first saw in Jesus. It's what characterized Jesus the whole way through his trial, the whole way through his life. A love and gentleness that always showed itself towards others, even to his enemies. But I think this is easy to misunderstand, because immediately most people see this as weakness. I mean, particularly in our culture. But that isn't the case at all. The kind of gentleness you see in Jesus and then in Paul is a kind of humility. It's a kind of self-forgetfulness that allows you to love other people, to look to the needs of other people. In fact, even further, to not insist on living in accordance with your rights. That you can choose to turn the other cheek. This kind of gentleness can bear the blows, can even bear opposition and insult. And do you know what else? It's one of the fruits of the Spirit. Which means it should characterize the life of every single follower of Jesus. Now I know what some of you are thinking. You're thinking, well, how can you live this way? How do you live? How? It's not realistic. Maybe for someone like Paul, at a stretch. But not someone like me. It seems unattainable. How is it possible? Let me tell you how. Only because of Jesus. See, Jesus not only teaches this, but enables this. Jesus enables us to not insist on our rights, to treat our enemies with love and not hate. But you must see this. Only because Jesus didn't insist on his rights am I freed from insisting on mine. The Bible says something utterly remarkable. It says Jesus had more rights than any of us. He's fully divine. He is the Son of God. He was the divine King who had a right to stay in heaven, who had a right to all the glory, he had a right to not die, and yet he came to earth and he refused to hold on to any of them. He came to earth to deal with my sinful self-centeredness. He gave all of them up for me, and the more I see Jesus doing that for me, the more I see Jesus bearing my sin by giving up his rights, then the more the Spirit allows me to live, not insisting on my own. Only the gospel will give you that perspective. And if you still think that sounds like a life of weakness, a recipe for being a doormat, constantly at the whim of a victim of the whims of other people, it is not a life like that. It is rather a strength. A strength unlike any other. A self-control, a strength of love for others that's so powerful it can reject every conceivable form of retaliation. Jesus actually teaches it's retaliation that's weakness. There's this wonderful old preacher called Charles Spurgeon in the 1800s in London. And here's the way he put it. We are to be as the anvil when the bad men are the hammers. An anvil is not weak. An anvil absorbs the blow of the hammer. Even though it looks like all the violence is being done by the hammer, it is the anvil where you find the deeper, purer, infinitely greater strength. Jesus is calling us to respond to evildoers with mercy, not justice. It's exactly what we see Paul do. That's why his message is respectful, but it's bold as well. Did you see that? There's a boldness not afraid to challenge. Again, listen to Paul's message. Festus says, Paul, you're out of your mind. It's fairly offensive, but he counters Festus. He isn't afraid to disagree. Chapter 26 and verse 25. We've read it already. He says, no, I'm not. These are true and rational words. He isn't afraid to do the same with the king as well. He keeps saying to the king, actually, I know you know these things. I know you know them. More than that, actually, he says, I know you believe much of this. And when Agrippa dismisses him, he is bold again. And I think probably my favourite line in the whole of the chapter. He says to him, whether short or long, I would to God that not only you, but also all who hear me this day might become such as I am. You can always see the flourish. Not these. Not the chains. I'm not speaking about the chains. I'm speaking about knowing Jesus. This is a room full of the most authoritative, influential people in the whole region. And Paul stands in front of them and he says before rulers and authorities with boldness and with grace, you need Jesus too. You need him. Now again, there's just so many things we could say. Boldness, gospel challenge comes for so many different reasons. But can I pull out a really surprising one? It's this. Because the joy of Christianity is contagious. It simply has to be shared. Don't you get that from Paul here? You have this from Paul. It's like, I still can't believe what's happened to me. Have you heard about a place called Damascus? Let me tell you, something happened on the road there. And I went from being the greatest persecutor of Jesus to the greatest advocate of Jesus. I cannot believe this has happened to somebody like me. And I have to tell you too. I've got to share this with you as well. And I wonder if you're not a Christian, this may deal with one of your greatest discomforts when it comes to Christianity. Because I know some of you are saying, this is it, this is the problem. You Christians, just be content with a powerful personal experience, won't you? Fine, historical to personal. Fine, absolutely fine, but why do you have to share it? Why do you have to impose it on other people? Why is it always, and I wish you would believe this thing as well? Well, just imagine for a moment, if this message is true, if we're not out of our minds, if all of this is actually the truth of what happened, if Jesus was who he said he was, if he did rise from the dead to offer hope to all, if we really experienced the power and the hope and the joy of that in our life, it would be criminal not to share it. I was remembering it this week. I used to read the Discworld novels by Terry Pratchett. And I read all of them. I love them. And there's a part where there's a priest. And he speaks to one of the stable characters. He's this wise old witch called Granny Weatherwax. And he tries to convert her. And the priest is sort of a bit hopeless. He's bumbling. He's a classic vicar stereotype. And she asks the priest if his God has ever been seen by anyone. And he says, well, yes. Thousands of people saw this God appear. And here is what she says to him in reply. She says, if I'd seen your God really there, really alive, it would be in me like a fever. If I thought there was some God who really did care two hoots about people, who watched them like a father, who cared for them like a mother, you wouldn't find me just generally being nice in the hope that everything would turn out right in the end. Not if the flame was burning in me. And I did say burning, because that's religion. Anything else is just being nice, a way of keeping in touch with the neighbours. Do you see? For a Christian, when they really experience Jesus, it's fire in the bones. It's joy like a fever. The historical has invaded the personal. It isn't just a way of being moral. We cannot but share this thing. Because it's beautiful news. Because joy is contagious. Because what we want for you and everyone else as well, more than anything else, is for you to experience this too. And here is the invite still today. It is to let the historical become the personal. To let Jesus encounter you and meet you even today. Even today. Let me pray. Father, I love these chapters. I love what we see in them. Thank you so much for all the riches. Thank you so much for this message that Paul stood before kings and authorities, rulers. As he says in the passage itself, before great and small alike, and shares with joy and a flame in his heart. My prayer today would be for those who have yet to know what this means. That's something of this message. The challenge of this message, the historical reality of the message, the personal need for this message would illuminate, would burst into their lives today. Jesus, I pray that would happen. I pray that you grant a gift of faith. And for those of us who know the historical Jesus as a personal reality, for our Spirit of God kindle a flame of sacred love on the mean altar of our hearts. And I pray that we would burn ever brighter with a contagious joy that you bring to us, Lord Jesus. It is a joy that can coexist with chains. It is a joy that can coexist with persecution. It is a joy that can stand in front of the worst situations and circumstances. Not a shallow, frothy joy, but one that runs deep. One that runs like a subterranean river. Spirit of God, give us, root us that joy. And would we be known as a church that wants to share the hope that is within us with a world desperate to hear a truth that is both factual but would affect the feelings, will make the heart explode. Jesus, we praise you and we thank you in your wonderful